Greetings. My name is Anne Skelton. I'm a member of the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, and I'm from South Africa. It gives me great pleasure to say a few words at the beginning of your roundtable. This is a subject matter close to my heart. I noticed that in the concept note for your roundtable, the famous words of Justice Albie Sachs from the case of S versus M are quoted. Well, indeed, this case is meaningful to me because as a children's rights lawyer, I presented the amicus curiae submissions in this matter. It was an important case for us in South Africa because up until that time, when primary caregivers were being sentenced, nobody thought very much about what would happen to the children. They were invisible in this very important decision that removed a parent away from them as children. But this case changed all of that. For the first time, it meant that a sentencing court had to properly consider the circumstances of the child. What would happen to the child that night if the caregiver of the child didn't come home as a result of being imprisoned? I think up until that time, what had happened was that the courts had always considered the offence, the community, and the rights of the offender, and perhaps had given some thought to children when considering the rights of the offender. But clearly, children are separate from their parents and need to be separately considered. So that's what the S versus M case set as a precedent for us in South Africa. It meant that from that time onward, every time a court sentenced a primary caregiver, it had to give special, separate consideration of the best interests of the child. What would the impact be if the primary caregiver ended up going to prison? And this also meant that thought had to be given to what kind of sentencing alternatives would be appropriate. And how does one do this difficult balancing act of the need to ensure a proper criminal justice system that indicates that there is accountability for wrongdoing, but at the same time keeping in mind that it can often be so counterproductive to remove someone from society when they are fulfilling a role as a caregiver in a family. So in South Africa, this precedent certainly changed the way that courts do business. And indeed, we've seen an impact in our case law since then. It's a good question, though, whether that is enough. Can we simply rely on precedents? Well, of course, in common law countries, precedents are binding, and so they have a very big impact. It might be different if you're working in a civil legal system. But I would say even in common law systems, there may be many benefits to be gained from having separate sentencing guidelines and from thinking carefully about what needs to happen if, for example, in a particular case, it's impossible to avoid a period of detention of the primary caregiver. What then? What then should happen with regard to the child? But indeed, as well, I think it's important to keep in mind that we want to do more restorative justice sentencing, and that was a big feature in the S versus M case as well. Justice Sachs pointed out that it is not, the criminal justice system need not only be punitive, but can also think of the possibility of giving people a chance, giving primary caregivers the opportunity to show that they can change their behavior. And very often restorative justice sentencing may be the best way to bring that to light. Of course, the other thing that we need to keep in mind is proportionality, and it is so that sometimes it will not be possible to find that a primary caregiver stays out of imprisonment. But even then, we need to temper the length of the sentence in order to make sure that children are not separated from the primary caregiver for any longer than is absolutely necessary. So in this full range of considerations, it's very important at all times to keep the best interests of the child in mind. So I wish you well in your deliberations, and I'm sure that it will be of great benefit to the children whose primary caregivers you will be sentencing in the future. All the best.